I'm still not convinced he doesn't have a self-pardon tucked away in Mar-a-Lago. He's talked about it, and he said publicly he was entitled to it. He's not. He's strategic. It might be helpful. So there could be that.
Wait, what do you mean tucked away in Mar-a-Lago? Like he granted it to himself while he was still in office, and it's sitting in a drawer somewhere?
Sure. I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charan, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by our regulars, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, Damon Linker, who writes the Substack newsletter Notes from the Middle Ground, and Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal. Our special guest this week is Kim Wehle, law professor, commentator, and author of many books, the most recent one being The Pardon Power. We are going to talk first with Kim Wehle for a few minutes about her book, and then we're going to have to say goodbye to her and then discuss other matters in the news. So Kim, thanks so much for being here. So it was not that long ago that we were all contemplating the possibility of a Trump self-pardon, and that was a huge concern. It may be less so now because of events, but before we get to whether it is in the offing, tell us what you learned in writing this very detailed historical deep dive into the pardon power. Did you what conclusion did you reach about whether a self-pardon is kosher?
Well, my hypothesis was that the general understanding of the pardon power is absolute and having no restraints seems to be what people just assume. That's wrong. That was my hypothesis, that it's wrong, and I think I was correct, both as a matter of history and as a matter of Supreme Court case law. The court has already put boundaries around the pardon power. Of course, has never said anything about a self-pardon because that's never happened in the history of America. And like everything under the Constitution, it's not so much what the Constitution allows, but is there any consequences for doing it? If there's no consequence, then all of a sudden it becomes something that the Constitution tolerates. I mean, I conclude in the book that a self-pardon should be unconstitutional. It violates sort of the common law notion that you can't be a judge in your own case. But it also would eviscerate the take care clause, requiring the presidents to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. But as you know, Mona, I write a lot for the Bulwark as well, and I've written on this. I think the Supreme Court's immunity decision did severe damage to the U.S. Constitution by rewriting that part of Article 2. So now with that, the pardon power has become much more treacherous because a president who can now use official power to commit crimes with impunity. If you want to get people to execute your orders to commit the crime, the way to do that is to promise pardons.
Yeah, I mean, it's so ripe for abuse and arguably already has been abused. Trump dangled pardons in front of a number of people who were in a position to do him harm in legal cases and got away with it. And granted those pardons in a couple of instances, Manafort. But yeah, this immunity decision creates a whole new set of problems. So in the past, the Congress has put constraints on presidential power in all kinds of ways. Just the most prominent recent example, there are many, but the most prominent recent example is the War Powers Act, right? Which, now admittedly, the Constitution divides war powers between the Congress and the executive, giving the Congress the power to declare war. But it was never really spelled out what the scope of the commander-in-chief power is. And so presidents have tended to say, oh, well, that's unconstitutional, that law, but it's never been tested. And so a lot of this would be new, right? If there were a challenge to the pardon power, because even though other presidents have abused the pardon power, they've never abused it quite like Donald Trump did, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And you make an excellent point. I mean, the commander-in-chief power now would also be a core power under the immunity decision, like the pardon power. And we've got all kinds of laws and regulations that limit the unlimited exercise of power through the military. I mean, just tons and tons. I'm not an expert in military defense law, but in theory, if you took the Supreme Court's logic to its extreme, all of that would be unconstitutional because it's lodged exclusively in the president, with the understanding, as you indicate, there's also the war power under Article 1. Yeah, it's the question you mentioned. Okay, could Congress pass laws? The reason that people just assume Congress can't pass laws is because of a few cases that happened back in the Civil War. Right, and back then, Lincoln was struggling with pardons for Confederates to get them to fight on behalf of the Union, to bring the country together, him and Johnson, after the war. So these are more sort of amnesty pardons. And at one point, there was a clash between Congress and Lincoln. Lincoln pardoned the Confederates and said, we'll give you back your confiscated property. Congress came in and said, no, you can pardon them, but we don't want them to give back the property. And the Supreme Court said, in that head-to-head between the president and the United States Congress, the president's pardon power wins. But that doesn't mean, Mona, as you know, you're a lawyer, that doesn't mean that there's no constraints ever under any circumstances under the pardon power. The court later held you can't force someone to take a pardon and thereby obliterate their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, right? So the pardon power, like the rest of the Constitution, needs to be balanced with other obligations and prerogatives and protections. And a self-pardon, in order to insulate yourself from any kind of criminal wrongdoing or oversight, that's antithetical to the rule of law itself in lots of ways. I mean, I could write a 60-page law review article on that particular issue, which is why I push back on this mythology that the pardon power is somehow the one remnant of King George III that is sacrosanct in America.
Right. And the Constitution itself says it cannot be granted in cases of impeachment. So clearly, even the founders didn't intend for it to be an absolute power. But okay. So let's get to the nut of this. Donald Trump, if he is, God forbid, reelected, could make the cases against him, except for the Georgia, except for the state cases. He could make the federal cases against him go away through his power over the Department of Justice. So why should we even be worried about a self-pardon, or why is it still relevant?
Well, there's some people that believe you'd still have to have a judge's buy-in to dismiss those cases. So maybe there would be some constraint. So if you had a Judge Chutkin who said, no, I want it going to a different team of prosecutors or something like that. I mean, that's hard to imagine, but there's a technical argument. If he does not win, and if it's Kamala Harris, the pardon could come up in two ways. One would be, and I'm still not convinced he doesn't have a self-pardon tucked away in Mar-a-Lago. He's talked about it, and he said publicly he was entitled to it. He's not. He's strategic. It might be helpful. So there could be that.
Wait, what do you mean tucked away in Mar-a-Lago? Like he granted it to himself while he was still in office, and it's sitting in a drawer somewhere? Sure.
I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't. I mean, just because he hasn't, through his lawyers, moved to dismiss the indictments on that basis doesn't mean that doesn't exist. And if it exists and it's signed at the time that he was president, I think his argument would be it's a valid pardon and it was accepted by him at the time he was president. And then that could come up through the courts if he raised it as a defense to one of these cases. I mean, he's knocking it out of the park with this majority anyway.
Yeah, Clarence Thomas would say that's totally fine. Yeah.
But then the flip side, Mona, of course, is, look what Gerald Ford did with Nixon, pardon Nixon. There could be some pressure on Kamala to pardon him and to move the country along and to bring some unity. I mean, I don't know, but it could come up both ways with Nixon having the precedence of a Ford pardon, which I think politically really injured Ford.
So what is your recommendation? Is your recommendation that Congress should pass laws that limit the pardon power, and how would you do that? Your elevator pitch for limiting the pardon power.
I'm a big proponent of the constitutional amendment that was just introduced over the summer to reverse the Supreme Court's immunity decision and put the Constitution back where it was before they meddled with it in May. That includes a ban on self-pardons. If it were me, I would amend that to include a ban on pardons for accomplices and co-conspirators in crimes, right? So that's the constitutional amendment side. On the congressional side, how about banning lobbying for pardons? One of Donald Trump's, the people that he pardoned this last week, was arrested for strangling his wife. He killed a police officer. Reportedly, that pardon came through Jared and Ivanka, right? Rudy Giuliani was reportedly peddling pardons for $2 million a pop. 6 members of Congress lobbied for pardons after the January 6th insurrection. So there could be, I don't think that would interfere with the president's pardon powers to ban lobbying for pardons. I would also argue that transparency, amendments to the FOIA or some kind of transparency that said, listen, you can still pardon as you want. You just got to make the record clear and public. That's what presidents did in the first half of the 20th century. The attorney general actually gave, first of all, 50% of the pardons were granted. The president read all the applications and the attorney general would give an accompanying rationale. I think that would be worthwhile. And then the last thing I would say is take the Office of Pardon Attorney out of DOJ. I mean, to have prosecutors decide whether the prosecutors messed up is kind of a conflict of interest. And of course, the president can ignore DOJ's recommendations, but if it was an independent committee or commission, which is the case in a lot of states, it's a case in many parts of the world, where those recommendations were made not by lawyers necessarily, but maybe former judges, former prison officials, prison reform advocates, so maybe people that had been in prison, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, have that kind of recommendation go on the president's desk. And then I think at the end, Mona, if there just was more public scrutiny, we'd have more conversations about this. And the last point I'll say, I'll just refer to George W. Bush, who I'm paraphrasing, when he left office, said, these last minute pardons are really a problem. These requests, this fever pitch request for favors at the very end with no accountability. And he recommended that presidents come in and have a stated policy and how they're going to exercise that power. So Kamala Harris could come in and say, this is how I'm going to use the pardon power. I'm a big alleged proponent of criminal justice reform. I know a lot about it as a former prosecutor. I want to use the pardon power to make sure taxpayer dollars aren't wasted keeping people in prison when there's exonerating evidence, for example, who are at extraordinarily long sentences for low-level crimes, or who are serving sentences. This is what Barack Obama did in 2014 to some degree, serving sentences under statutes that have been revised and are a lot more lenient now, but they were caught in some, a net when there was a much more stringent penalty. So I think there's a lot that could happen, Mona, if we had conversation, which like we're doing now. So I appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Good luck with the book. And thanks so much for joining us on Beg to Differ.
Thanks, Mona. It was great. Enjoyed it.
All right. Before we turn to our next topic, we're going to hear a word from Miracle Made. Well, it's still hot outside, and that nighttime temperature can have a big impact on how you sleep. If you wake up too hot or too cold, I recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. Miracle Made sheets are inspired by NASA and use silver-infused fabrics that are temperature regulating, so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. Traditional bed sheets can harbor more bacteria than a toilet seat. It can lead to all kinds of problems, and it's gross. Miracle Made offers a whole line of self-cleaning antibacterial bedding, such as sheets, pillowcases, and comforters that prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth and require less laundry. They are self-cooling, which provides for a better night's sleep. They are infused with silver that prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth. They're designed for your skin, so you can stop sleeping on bacteria, and they're comfortable. Miracle Made sheets are luxuriously comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands and feel as nice, if not nicer, than sheets used by some 5-star hotels. So go to trymiracle.com/beg-to-differ. Whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo Beg to Differ at checkout, you'll also get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product that they back it with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/beg to differ and use the code beg to differ to claim your free 3-piece towel set. Save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/beg to differ to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this podcast. All right. This week we had the really heartbreaking, wrenching story of 6 hostages that were being held by Hamas, that were executed with shots to the back of their heads just before Israeli troops found them deep inside tunnels under Rafah in Gaza. And we have not discussed the whole Gaza war in a very long time. And I have to say that that was my decision, mostly because it is just so difficult to have a policy discussion about what to do. It is such a difficult, wrenching situation. But there are reasons to discuss it this week, not least of which is that the campuses are filling up again. The school year has begun. There are already big protests. There are bound to be more. And in the wake of this unbelievably sadistic act by Hamas, and it wasn't just the murder, bear in mind, it was that, well, first of all, one of the hostages we now know, a woman, had, and they were all young, they were all in their 20s. I think the oldest was 40. One of them was a woman was down to 79 pounds. So she had been starved in captivity. So there's that. And then there is this particular piece of sadism from Hamas. They released videos of the murdered captives after they were dead, just to inflict more grief and misery on the families and on the whole country of Israel. So this has caused a huge number of people to pour into the streets of Tel Aviv in protest. There is a huge internal debate in Israel about this. So I'm going to turn to you first, Linda. There are no simple answers here. Netanyahu, who is not trusted by the vast majority of the Israeli public, he's not trusted to be making decisions that are for the best interests of the country and not for his own personal interests. That's the big problem. But it's possible that he is right in this particular instance because, this whole horrible deal making where you release, hundreds of murderers in exchange for hostages does incentivize the taking of more hostages. And yet the majority of Israelis want the deal. What do you say?
Well, it's unbelievable that this happened. And you're absolutely right about the problem with releasing prisoners from Israel in return for releasing people who were taken hostage. I mean, you have to remember that Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas, was in fact released by Israel in an earlier exchange many years ago. And so these are not people who are in Israeli jails because they're Palestinian. They're in Israeli jails because they're murderers. They are terrorists. They are people who've committed terrible crimes. And so that is a problem. The other problem is one of the sticking points seems to be who is going to have control of the crossing between Egypt and Gaza, the southern crossing. And that is, of course, the way that Hamas has brought in all of the materials to build those tunnels, which have held the hostages and where they were killed, and to bring in arms. And to turn this over somehow to a third party. I mean, I don't know who's a trusted third party in this. It's not like even UN agencies have not been implicated in terms of housing some of the terrorists, having their facilities used in this time period. So it is a problem. I mean, unfortunately, Netanyahu is very unpopular, and so that's why you see these massive people in the streets, these massive demonstrations. But you have a prime minister, you have a government, whether you like it or not, that was elected, in which there were bargains made between parties to keep Netanyahu in power. And I don't know. It's a conundrum, and maybe others have solutions. I certainly don't. But it is clear that if the IDF gets closer to hostages, they don't want another scene as they had earlier, where hostages were rescued by the IDF, and so they will execute these people.
Bill, one of the things we've also seen in the last few years, and this is not to diminish at all the suffering of the Gazan Palestinians, which has been horrific. But one of the things that we have seen is Israeli authorities cooperating with those who are immunizing children for polio, because there was a polio outbreak, which among the many horrible things that have happened to the population of Gaza in the last year. But the fact is, they are allowing this immunization program to go forward. It is apparently going very well. They're going to immunize something like 600,000 people under the age of 18. And, or I'm not sure what the age is. It might actually be younger than that, because the older ones have already been immunized. But that is not the kind of behavior that you would expect from a genocidal regime, right? Pausing to allow immunizations for polio. And it just does underline the fact that the rhetoric about the war in the West and in other parts of the world bears very little relation to the reality. I mean, it is just so off the charts. But what's your reaction to any of that, and to what Linda said?
Well, I don't have clear answers more than anyone else does. They probably don't exist. But given the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu's motives are so widely mistrusted, and not just in official quarters in Washington, but throughout the Israeli population. And I have a lot of informants in various points along the political spectrum, and they agree on almost nothing, except doubting, the motives of the prime minister, because of the obvious consequences of allowing his coalition to break up. So in these circumstances, it's very difficult for me to take the prime minister's word that continued occupation by Israel of the Philadelphia corridor, between Gaza and Egypt, or on that border, is a military necessity. I would want to hear from the leaders of IDF and the leaders of the intelligence services. I would feel much more comfortable if there were a clear statement from them that in this case, the alternative is as stark as the prime minister says it is. As I'm sure all of the viewers, the well-informed viewers on this podcast, and that means all of you, know, there have been many points in the past 300 plus days in which the military and the intelligence services have flatly disagreed with the prime minister's assessment. We need to know that in order to know what to think about the current situation. Uh, and, I totally agree with your point, about, pausing for immunizations not exactly being consistent with the behavior of a genocidal power. But you don't need that evidence because, in fact, lots of international lawyers have agreed on the point that whatever your qualms about what Israel is doing in Gaza, their conduct does not get close to meeting the official definition of genocide that the International Criminal Court itself uses. It's my understanding that even the ICC, which is not exactly friendly to Israel, did not take that step in its ruling. So all of which is to underscore the accuracy of your comment.
Damon, so from what I gather, some defense and foreign policy security types in Israel have actually disputed the prime minister's claim that the Philadelphia corridor, has to be kept now. It's life or death for Israel, saying they could go right back in. And then Netanyahu responds, no, I don't mean as a military matter. I mean diplomatically. Once you relinquish it, then you come under huge international pressure not to go back. And that's the problem. And then, of course, the riposte to that is, well, wait a minute. You're saying that you're going to resist international pressure. That's a big selling point for you, is that you stand up to the United States and the EU and so on for Israel's sake. But you've already been caving to international pressure, and you're saying that in the future you're going to cave to international pressure. So which is it?
Yeah, I can't stand Netanyahu. I've been something less than a fan for a very long time, and the events of the last year have solidified that even more. I probably reached my current nadir just before, or the 6 months before October 7th last year, over the whole court reform push and his seeming indifference to the really ongoing roiling boil of opposition in protests among roughly half the country that they did not approve of this pretty extreme attempt to change the way this Israeli Supreme Court does its business, with all things granted to, the arguments on both sides. I think there are strong arguments on both sides, including by the right that the Supreme Court is activist in a left-leaning way, in a way that American conservatives have also decried for decades here, and even more so in the Israeli context. But that doesn't mean that you undertake a very dramatic reform of that institution when you command barely or slightly under majority support for doing it. We have our own parallel mistakes being proposed by the right here all the time, and sometimes on the left as well, where like winning not even 50% plus one, but a bare plurality somehow entitles the winning party to basically remake the country and its image, without the fact that almost an identical number of Americans, or even more if you're Donald Trump and you actually didn't even win a plurality of the popular vote, that they don't support you. At the same time, I do want to say that as a matter of kind of, liberal democratic etiquette, moral etiquette, I'm hesitant to be too much in favor of saying we must defer to the military and intelligence authorities in a liberal democracy over the elected head of the government, because civilian control of the military is one of the key principles of liberal democratic self-governance. And obviously we want to know what those people who are informed think, but they often disagree with each other. And then it comes down to a judgment call. And we rightly say that the elected representatives are the ones who are supposed to make those calls. And that's Benjamin Netanyahu at the moment. And so I agree that he's not trustworthy, that he has all kinds of ulterior motives to prolonging the war, to saying it's never quite finished, that it requires more kind of slow growing grind, because he's afraid that if the war actually comes to an end, that there will be calls for new elections that he won't be able to resist. And he, unlike, most elected leaders, not only would he face losing, but he could also face jail time as a result. So he's, as with our Trump situation, there's a motivation to stay in office to avoid legal consequences for past acts. So what does it boil down to? A really bad situation. Where the situation is terrible in its own terms because of the intractability of the issues on the ground. But then you have to add in the fact that the elected government in power is not a great one. And I don't see how it ends, when it ends. When will Netanyahu eventually say, okay, we achieved our aims, it's over? I don't see that happening in a week, in a month. I don't know. We're about to have, in about a month from now, we're going to have the 1-year anniversary of the October 7th attack, and it still goes on. And I don't see an end in sight, frankly. There's still a lot of hostages to be found or rescued or executed. It's really bad.
Yeah. Linda, when the war first began, they said their war aim was the complete and total destruction of Hamas. But it's not clear how that is achieved. It really is.
Right.
It's such a vague thing. If any member of Hamas is extant, or if Yahya Sinwar continues alive, does that mean that the whole war was for nothing? It's a terrible. It's a terrible confusion. It seems to me. It is,
and we have to remember, even though it was only one election, one time, I think the reason Hamas was in power in Gaza was that the people in Gaza elected Hamas to represent them. There was a lot of corruption in the Palestinian Liberation Front. They wanted them out of the way, and so they elected Hamas. Now, that is the problem. We hear a lot, not just from the left, but from the center. And even Vice President Harris has suggested that, we need a two-state solution for the Palestinian people. And that has been American policy for as long as I can remember. But it's problematic because, if Hamas, you can't eliminate an idea. And Hamas is more than just a collection of people. It's more than just Yahya Sinwar. It's more than just his lieutenants. It is an idea. And that idea is the destruction of the state of Israel. And so this is a real problem. And how you're going to figure out that you have done enough to be able to declare victory and pull out, I think Netanyahu probably is not interested in doing that anytime soon. And as others have suggested, he has reason to want to stay in power, not to necessarily, have a solution. I think once there is a solution, there's going to be a move for elections. And it doesn't seem like Benjamin Netanyahu would be reelected, even with the coalition of extreme right groups that he put together.
Bill, usually in war, when you inflict enough punishment on your enemy, the enemy gives up or, surrenders. But this war against this religious fanatics cult called Hamas, which unfortunately has a lot of support from Iran and other sources, they're indifferent to the suffering of their own people. They're willing to inflict maximum suffering and death on their own people in the name of this sort of, religious goal of jihad. And so it's holy war for them. And that is an awfully difficult thing for a liberal democracy to cope with. You would say, well, you can't kill an idea, as Linda said, but, we killed Nazism pretty good because we inflicted enough damage on the society that they had to eventually give up. Same thing with Japan. In this case, you could wipe out just about everybody, and they would still, as long as one guy could pull his head up from the rubble and say Hamas, lives, then they haven't succeeded, right?
When you put it that way, it's hard to disagree. Look, going back to one of your examples, Germany did not surrender until Hitler killed himself. And I don't think that this war will be over until Sinwar is captured or killed. I think it's as simple as that. That's when the war ends. And apparently, on at least one occasion, the IDF has gotten pretty close. I mean, they issued a press release to the effect that Sinwar's coffee was still warm, when they reached his lair. And so we can't rule out the possibility that, the IDF will do even better or get lucky and get him. And then we'll be having a different conversation. Then we'll be having a conversation about the day after, which presents its own difficulties. So I think it would be premature to suggest that there's no way that the current conflict ends. It is not premature to say that Israel has done very little to indicate what would happen after it ends. And the reason for that is that Netanyahu probably couldn't clarify that without busting up his coalition.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
So we have and another way of putting this point is that as far as Israel's concerned, the war cannot end until the most extreme members of Netanyahu's coalition agree that it's time to end it. Because if they don't, and Netanyahu proceeds, they'll bring down the government.
Yeah.
So that is the reality that we face. And I don't see any way around that reality. And just to pile difficulty upon difficulty, the extremists in the cabinet, at least this is my understanding, are insisting that the only way to prevent this from happening again is for Israel to reoccupy Gaza.
Yep.
Which the IDF is implacably opposed to for all sorts of very good military and not just military reasons. So the problem doesn't end when the war ends. It just turns into a different problem. I could go on, but I think I've probably depressed everybody enough, so I'll stop.
Okay. Damon, one more observation about the war before turning to the campuses. And I don't want this to go on too long, but I do think it's worth dwelling for just a moment on this, because you hear so much in the West, basically from everybody in Europe, everybody, in the United States who's of goodwill. They all say, there's too much suffering and death on both sides. And what we need is to end the war and provide a two-state solution. Everyone says this, and it is a fantasy. I mean, I'm sorry to say, I was for a two-state solution for the longest time. I still am. I've always been, basically. I still am. But you have to be realistic. Hamas does not want two states. Hamas's goal, its only goal, is to obliterate the state of Israel. And it has a very powerful sponsor behind it in Iran that wants the same thing. And so when people talk blithely about a two-state solution as if this were a territorial dispute rather than an existential issue, I think that it's so naive and so simplistic. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, for other reasons too. I mean, clearly, if Hamas is treated as the primary spokesperson for the Palestinian people, then yeah, there's no possibility ever of there being a two-state solution. We don't really know the content of Palestinian public opinion, in Gaza in the midst of this war where Israel is blowing it up all the time and killing people. I doubt it's very positive. But then there's also of course, the West Bank, which is its own situation that is very difficult, and we don't exactly know what public opinion there holds because they haven't really had an election in, I don't know, a good portion of my adult life. And so we don't have a way of gauging exactly where the Palestinian people are on this question at the moment, if they are in the kind of maximalist anti-Israeli Hamas place, or is it somewhere in the middle? But then there's also Israeli public opinion, and we could talk till the cows come home about why that has ended up the way it is. But most Israelis don't favor the creation of a Palestinian state by this point either. Since the Second Intifada,
That's right.
Israeli public opinion has shifted quite a bit to the right. And most Israelis before October 7th were opposed to it. That's why we have the elected government of Israel that we do, that we're complaining about and upset about its extremism in some cases, and also fragility, where Netanyahu goes this way and the government will fall, he goes that way and the government will fall, because Israeli public opinion is very fractious, and it took 4 elections for him even to form a stable government. The last government was this cross-ideological one that was created just to prevent Netanyahu from getting back in power, and it didn't last. So, I mean, Israeli public opinion is not in a place to seriously consider the creation of a Palestinian state, and that was before the 7th.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that. But the occasion and reasons for gloom on this subject are so enumerated that we could go on forever.
Yeah. Okay. Bill, speaking of people who don't think in subtleties and don't understand the full context of a problem, the students are back on campus, and you had a piece this week talking about the problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses and the failure of some of these major institutions to handle it. So why don't you just sketch out just a few examples of the kinds of things that are in these reports that Jewish students have encountered, and then say what you like about, how you hope to see them change, the universities change their tack.
Yeah. Well, as they say in Washington, thanks for asking. I sat down and read 2 very long, detailed reports on campus anti-Semitism. One that just came out from Columbia University, and the other that was published a couple of months ago out of Stanford. And they make for grim reading, because, the harassment of Jewish students, both Israeli Jews and American Jews, has been widespread. The Columbia story, rather the Columbia report, heard hundreds and hundreds of stories from Jewish students on campus when they started listening. And, they included incidents of Jewish students being shoved up against walls, of having necklaces with Jewish symbols ripped from their necks, of being chased by individuals or even small mobs. There was an Israeli student at Columbia who went to the Columbia Health Services for a health problem. And for a long time, nobody came to see her. And she heard a discussion in the next room as to where one of the medical personnel said, I don't support treating her because of her background, her national origin. It just goes on and on and on. And what became, really clear to me as I read the reports was that even when universities had good, clear rules, and most of them didn't, the rules were not enforced. And so substantial portions of the student population in these two universities and many others were placed at risk. The phrase, "I feel unsafe," is promiscuously overused, particularly among college students. But in this case, students were unsafe, just as an objective matter. Their physical security was at risk and was not protected by university administrations. And the record, I think, is incontestable on that point. And so I recommend a number of steps, including the promulgation of clear rules to each and every returning student in writing, backed up by an oral briefing for all students at which attendance would be mandatory, and a schedule of responses to major disruptions of university life. I actually proposed a 3-level response where for the first offense, you get a severe, clear warning, including what will happen to you if you do it again. For the second offense, a mandatory suspension for at least a semester. And for the third offense, 3 strikes and you're out. You are expelled from the university without the possibility of returning to it. Interestingly, some people who reacted to my Wall Street Journal piece said, you lily-livered liberal, why are you giving them 3 chances, off of their heads for the first time? And I said, I threw up my hands at that point and said, all right. But the point that I made in the piece is that rules that aren't enforced are nullities. Not a very profound point, but apparently one that's escaped university administrators until very recently. And that if the offending students do not have good reason to believe that there will be consequences for misbehavior, they'll not only keep it up, but they'll escalate because they've been given a sense of impunity that will encourage them to escalate. So that, in brief, is what I argued in my piece. And I have to say, I've gotten a more positive response to this piece than I have from many of my others across the political spectrum.
I'm glad to hear that. Linda, these institutions of higher learning seem to be woefully ignorant of certain things that you would have thought were basic, like you can have time, place, and manner restrictions on how people express themselves, and you can enforce that, right? I mean, yes, you're allowed to go down to the quad at 2 p.m. and say down with Israel. You're not allowed to do it at 2 a.m. in front of the dorms. Time, place, and manner.
Right. Exactly.
And you're not allowed to. You can express yourself in certain situations where it's where it's not impinging on anybody else's rights. But you can't limit the movements of students and say, I'm sorry, you cannot pass here to the UCLA library. This happened last spring, until you say you're a non-Zionist,
Right.
That's at an American university. I mean, it is just astounding. And, so that's sort of an editorial comment, but one thing that we all worried about, I think we probably even discussed it last spring, but one thing that we worried about was that universities would learn the wrong lessons and that they would say, okay, so now we just have to add Jews to the long list of students who are, who deserve special protection, like, underrepresented minorities. And that's the wrong lesson, right?
It is the wrong lesson. And, I've got a son who's a very active alum from the University of Maryland. And he told me last week that Students for Justice in Palestine had obtained a permit to be able to have a demonstration on October 7th. And my guess is there are lots of places around the country where these are going to be given. Well,
Yep.
As you can imagine, that caused a furor. And so the president of the university rescinded the permit. Now, there is nothing that says they can't have that demonstration on October 6th or on October 8th. And by the way, what the president said was there will be no demonstrations on October 7th. So that means Jewish students will not be able to essentially focus on the horror that occurred on October 7th. So there are lots of wrong lessons being learned here. And the biggest problem, it seems to me, is the ignorance of students about the cause they're supporting. My guess is that most of the students who are showing up at these demonstrations, who are even camping out in places, gays for Palestine, feminists for Palestine, they don't seem to have any idea about who the people are that they are supporting. Feminists supporting the Hamas, and even just looking at the pictures of Gaza, most of the women are fully garbed in the hijab. Women do not have the kind of freedom of movement in Hamas-controlled areas or in most of the fundamentalist Muslim world that people who call themselves feminists would certainly agree to. And I mean, that goes triply, quadruply so for the notion of gay people having any sort of rights in these countries. So it is this fundamental ignorance of students. It's not similar, for example, to the kinds of demonstrations that took place against apartheid in South Africa. It's not even, in the Vietnam War, the kind of protests that took place there, where, I happen to not agree with people like John Kerry, who threw away his medals, etc. And I didn't agree with a lot of the anti-Vietnam protesters, but you can't say that they were totally ignorant. And even Jane Fonda, who went and did propaganda for the government in Hanoi, came back later and apologized for what she had done. So I don't know how you deal with this. This is a bigger problem than this particular issue. It is the problem of Americans, and particularly American young people, who know so little history, know so little of the world, that they can't have informed positions on these issues.
There was a video that circulated of a Arab woman in the hijab berating a fellow protester who was a gay for Hamas or a gay for Palestine or something, and she said, "We don't want you in our movement," and she was screaming at him, and I thought, great, you guys could let them fight. That's terrific. But yeah, so Damon, Linda points out there's a lot of ignorance. Absolutely there is. There's also a lot of fashion that goes with this, the oppressed versus the oppressors, which is the template that the left, the ultra left imposes on everything, even when it doesn't map onto other conflicts neatly. In the Middle East, in the Israel situation, you've got competing victimizations. Both sides have plenty of victimization to talk about, and so it's not so simple. But the thing I am most exercised about is not that, because I think we'll always have ignorant students who will attach themselves to fashionable causes. But what I'm concerned about is that the universities don't have a clear sense of their own responsibility. These are supposed to be places of higher learning. These are supposed to be places that teach people how to evaluate evidence, how to debate in a civil fashion, how to have tolerance for views you don't agree with. And for universities to not understand, they could simply apply First Amendment law, which is very clear. We have it's been established for a long time. What is free speech and what is not covered by free speech? What's not covered are threats, true threats, harassment, incitement, bullying, those kinds of things, and certainly physical altercations. Universities can easily have it within their power to say, if you feel strongly about that issue, fine, please come to a debate in, such and such hall at such and such a time. We will hear from all sides. Everybody will have an opportunity to speak, and you can make your feelings known. But you may not disrupt classes. You may not make other students feel unsafe. You may not, et cetera. What say you? You are at a university.
I am at a university, and so far it's quiet this semester. But I note that the last time I was asked about this on this podcast and gave an answer, that very afternoon, I left my office where we were recording this, or where I was recording my portion of it, and got stuck in a traffic jam because a bunch of Gaza protesters were coming in, and then they took over the quad and, made a lot of headlines. You may have heard about the University of Pennsylvania protests last spring, among the more raucous in the country. And that all happened right after I said things were quiet. So I've now cursed this fall semester, I fear. Just as I think it is exactly right that the situation in the Middle East is much more complicated than the Manichaean children of light, children of dark narrative that the left prefers, which it then kind of maps on to a kind of historical progressivism, the oppressors and the oppressed, and therefore it's like all good against all evil. It's childish kind of narrative and just so story that the left constructs, and that some people, especially young people, find extremely seductive because it makes sense of things. It gives them a kind of moral meaning to their lives and something they can fight for to make the world a better place. But I think the complicated that's a simplifying narrative. But similarly, what's going on college campuses is also, I think, a little more complex than the way it's framed sometimes indicates. For instance, I've seen studies showing that last spring with the protests, they happened predominantly at the most elite institutions, not at other institutions. That's why we keep hearing the names of Ivy League universities at the top of lists for places where these protests are going on. Secondly, even at those elite universities, it's a small portion of the student population. that is engaging in these protests. And it's not just the Jewish students who aren't happy with them because they're being physically threatened by them, or emotionally threatened by them, ideologically threatened. It's the average, everyday run-of-the-mill student who has no dog in the fight on either side and just wants to be able to go to class or study in peace and not have to go a half mile around to get to their classroom because fences have been put up to prevent a march or something. So I think it's important to keep that kind of perspective and realize that this isn't a kind of indictment of all college students or even most college students. This is a small militant faction of people who have bought in to a kind of pernicious oversimplifying story that they find politically, morally, existentially meaningful for them. And I wish that the university administrators would look upon them in that light. Very briefly, I think they on the one hand often sort of have a PR mindset where like they want to placate the noisy students to make it go away so it doesn't generate headlines, doesn't scare the donors and make their lives miserable. On the other hand, they are usually kind of a little to the left themselves, though not as far left as most of the protesters. But because
Although, by the way, Columbia had to fire 3 administrators for anti-Semitic texts.
Yeah. Columbia has a particularly big problem with this, and it has for a long time. In addition to the fact that the administrators there might be more radicalized than in other places, there's the fact that Columbia is in the middle of New York City, which is this melting pot with lots of people, and that means there are more radicals off campus there than there are in most places, and they all gather there in Morningside Heights to kind of participate. So it's largely a closed campus, and there are gates, and they can be closed for safety of students. But that means right outside the gates, you get these large confluences of non-students who are there just to make trouble.
Yeah.
So
by the way, just FYI, a small little footnote. I actually went there undergrad, and in all of the years that I have seen Columbia, visited, I've never seen them close those gates.
Yeah,
ever,
except for
until this year.
This
they finally
spring
closed them, and they made you had to show a student ID or a
Right.
university ID to get in.
And I understand why, but it also created more of a problem because then you have a bottleneck, and the Jewish students have to actually go through that same gate if they live off campus.
And be harassed by the people outside. Yep.
Right. Yeah. I'll leave it at that because we're probably running late by this
Okay.
point.
All right. Well, not happy about my alma mater. By the way, Columbia, some of this is so self-inflicted. Columbia has used its history of student protests from back in the 60s days as part of their recruiting of new students. They're proud of it. So,
Well, the history of Columbia and Cornell protests in the story of kind of the neoconservative movement is actually extremely important. And
it is.
It's amusing to see it all coming back around here a couple generations later.
All right, let's just take a few minutes to discuss something that happened this week that is not surprising and yet shocking, as the saying goes, which is Tucker Carlson, freshly back from Moscow, where he fawned over Putin, has now conducted an interview on his program, which is still wildly popular on the right. He conducted an interview with a so-called historian who presented the view that the actual villain of the Second World War was Winston Churchill, among other things, and that basically Holocaust denial. Basically, this fellow was saying, well, the Germans just resorted to killing prisoners because they had accumulated so many more POWs than they could possibly handle. First of all, that would not be an excuse. Second, that's not at all what happened. These were not POWs. I mean, you don't even want to dignify it, but Damon, I'm going to go back to you because you had initially planned to make this your low light of the week, but spell out some of the implications of this for us.
Well, I suppose the main point I'd want to make is something I'm going to crib from John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. And by the way, he and I are not fans of each other. So I don't normally revert to him as an authority, but I did listen to the Commentary Magazine podcast this week about this Tucker Carlson event. And he made a very good point that I haven't heard said elsewhere. I might expand on it in a post next week. It's as if Tucker Carlson has decided that because he so loathes, to speak of the neocons, as I did a moment ago, neoconservative foreign policy, or what used to be called that, kind of muscular liberal internationalism. Well, we can use a shorthand for it. Because he so dislikes that, he thinks that his role should be to create a far-right equivalent to what Howard Zinn accomplished with his People's History of the United States decades ago, which is to create a new kind of meta-narrative for the far right to enable an alternative way of America engaging with the world, where it's not that the United States and its allies in World War II stood up for liberal democracy against totalitarian dictatorships with communist totalitarian Stalin by our side, if in pure, realpolitik terms, because the enemy of our enemy had to be our temporary friend, because Hitler was at war with both of us. And then the Cold War following that, and then the Soviet Union collapses, and it leaves American liberal democracy triumphant and in a role of overseeing global order. He wants to subvert that by suggesting with guests on his show, because he's not anything like a historian. He can't write a book like Howard Zinn did, but he wants to invite people on to foster an alternative story, which is basically that all of what I just said is the exact opposite of the truth. Hitler was a poor, misunderstood fellow who killed a lot of people, including Jews, because it was a kind of euthanasia act of mercy for them, because they didn't have enough food to feed these prisoners. And then the reason why we even had World War II is that our great ally, Winston Churchill, was actually the bad guy. The only reason we even had a war was because of Churchill. And similarly with what he's done with Russia, going there and making it seem as if Putin's Russia is this prosperous, peaceful, wonderful, lovely place. And I do think that Podhoretz is onto something here, and it helps to explain what it is Tucker is doing, because I know a lot of people who worked with him, and I should add that Podhoretz makes the point on the podcast that one of the things that he very much regrets, he actually apologizes to America for hiring Tucker Carlson at the Weekly Standard in the mid-90s and giving him the start of his journalistic career. And people who worked with him say he's very smart, he writes well, he's not a moron, this leads to a lot of consternation in our circles about what is he doing? Did he become idiotic, evil? What is the motive here? And I think the motive is probably something in the direction that Podhoretz suggests, and that I elaborated a little bit, which is the construction of a useful history for the far right, which for whatever reason Tucker has decided is the way to go, would be best for America. And, on that, we can certainly roll our eyes and wonder how the hell he came to that conclusion. But it's pretty clear that that is what he believes at this point.
Linda, there is a tendency on the right that I noticed, and maybe it's on the left too. I think not in the same way, but I noticed even when I was a part of it, which is there is this oppositional defiant disorder thing that goes on with conservatives, where whatever the liberals are for, they're against. And it can take, at the time, it took ridiculous form for me. I mean, I remember some of the people that I knew deliberately taking up smoking because, it was very politically incorrect. And therefore they were going to start smoking, fully aware of the problem. But it has now, in this internet age, it has gotten to be on steroids. And there's a style where no matter what it is, if you are in opposition to received wisdom on any subject, vaccine safety, whatever it is, then you are the brave truth teller. And so what, I guess eventually it all has to come. If this tendency keeps going, eventually you've got to come to Hitler and say, maybe
not so bad.
Not so bad.
Well, I think you're definitely right in your psychoanalysis of some of the people on the far right in terms of their, oppositional disorder. But I think there's something else at play here, and in many ways it's more serious. People who are sort of center right have, I think, rightly pointed out the anti-Semitism that occurs on the left, on the far left. It is real. We just talked about it on the program. But let's not forget that anti-Semitism, at least in its 20th century variety, and before that as well, has stemmed from the right. And that you just cannot get past the fact that what Tucker Carlson is doing is promoting anti-Semitism. And I fear that there are many in the MAGA movement who will go there. They may say they love Israel. Some of the Christian right certainly loves Israel in part because they believe that Israel has to be occupied by Jews for the second coming of Christ to come. So it's a kind of theological position that they take, but they separate that, I think, from some of the more traditional anti-Semitism. And this anti-Semitism is extremely dangerous. And when people, see someone like Tucker Carlson promoting these kinds of ideas, I think it's really dangerous, and I worry about it because Trump himself, he may have a Jewish son-in-law and a convert to Judaism in his daughter, Ivanka. But I think that he's hosted anti-Semites at Mar-a-Lago. He certainly likes Tucker Carlson, and he certainly has retweeted things on his True Social that are anti-Semitic and made kind of anti-Semitic references even before Jewish groups. I like Jewish people to handle my money, or whatever it was he said, I think, before the Republican Jewish Coalition back in 2016. So it is very worrisome, and it is the original hate. I mean, it is the longest standing prejudice in civilization, and I really worry about it.
Bill, it isn't just a fringe figure. Tucker Carlson is very close to Trump. Prominent role at the convention. Apparently, was one of the people who wanted J.D. Vance to be chosen as VP. And this month, September 21st, there's going to be an event that is sponsored by Carlson, where J.D. Vance is the featured speaker. So this is not like Fever Swamps, Far from Power. This is right at the center now of the powers that be in the GOP.
I actually think it's pretty simple at this point. In addition to everything else that people have said, Carlson is desperate for attention. There is nothing that he won't say or do to regain the kind of prominence that he enjoyed not so long ago. So that's point number one, and it's taking a particularly virulent and dangerous form. Those of us who are not on the right with memories remember people like Sam Francis, Pat Buchanan, and a host of others. William F. Buckley honorably expelled those people from the conservative movement, or tried to. And the challenge is now, I think, to all people who think of themselves as honorable conservatives to draw the line and say, this man should no longer be received in respectable company, and the company that receives him is no longer respectable. And if J.D. Vance, after this, shows up at a conference sponsored by Tucker Carlson, I hope that conservatives, whether they support Donald Trump or not, will have, to use a favorite phrase on the right, the moral clarity, not only to say the right thing, but to do it. And if they don't, as far as I'm concerned, it's war. This is so completely unacceptable. The mainstreaming of Holocaust denial by someone this close to the center of the new power in the Republican Party. This is, I think, a real moment of truth for all these people, including J.D. Vance, including Donald Trump. Are you going to draw the line or aren't you? And if you're not, then that tells me everything I need to know about everything you claim to stand for.
All right. On that note, we will turn to our final segment, the highlight or low light of the week. Damon Linker.
Well, originally I was going to be make my, as Mona noted, that my low light, the Tucker thing, and then a highlight within that low light would have been the John Podhoretz podcast comment about Howard Zinn. But I switched over to the other big news story this week about the right. And this is a really massive low light. This is the story of a Justice Department indictment of a company, the two founders of a company called Tenet Media, that supposedly, allegedly took $10 million of money from Russia to hire a series of right-wing influencers, as they are called. In other words, pundits, but sort of less than what you'd normally think of as a pundit. People like Tim Pool and Benny Johnson, kind of right-wing opinion journalist muckrakers who rant on and on about the evils of the left, and in Tim Pool's case about how Ukraine is the ultimate enemy of the United States and so forth. Things that, like Putin's government in Russia would be quite pleased with. And in the indictment, it spells out that Tim Pool, for example, was hired to be paid $100,000 a week to do one video a week. This was his salary. So he's making, roughly $400,000 a month on this. And this is just completely absurd. Nobody asked about, where this money was coming from, or supposedly asked where it was coming from. And it's just an influence peddling operation from Russia. Once more, we see where the right has ended up with Tucker Carlson on one track, and then some of its fringy right-wing influencers with, sometimes 1 million or so followers on Twitter on the other, with money coming straight from the coffers of the Russian intelligence operations. So there we are. I don't know what else to say about it.
Thank you for that. I would just note a former colleague of mine at the Bulwark, Amanda Carpenter, had a great tweet this week on the topic where she just said, in 2016, the Russians had to set up these sock puppet accounts to give their version of of propaganda. She said in 2024, all they had to do was give money to actual right-wing influencers. Okay, Linda.
Well, that is really depressing. I've got another depressing story for my low light of the week, and it's actually a news story right out of the New York Times. And the title of it is Republicans Seize on False Theories About Immigrant Voting. And it's really describes a campaign among Republican activists to try to stop people who are not citizens from voting. The problem, of course, with that is that non-citizens don't vote. And every study, including one by the Heritage Foundation and other academic studies, have shown that the number of non-citizens casting votes in 2016 and in 2020 were not in the single digits, but certainly under 100 out of 23 million votes in 2016. I think one study found 30 examples of non-citizens voting. And yet the Republican Party is out there working in states like Georgia, Texas, Montana, Ohio, and other places to go into immigrant communities and to try to essentially intimidate voters because, you can be an immigrant and vote so long as you are a naturalized citizen. And it's a campaign that's very ethnically focused, focused obviously on Latino neighborhoods. And it's really sort of a page out of the Jim Crow playbook, as the New York Times notes, from the past in the way in which blacks were intimidated from voting. It is already illegal to vote if you are a non-citizen. And in fact, people have who did, in one case, mistakenly cast a vote in Texas were arrested. And I think the person ended up being sentenced to jail in that particular case. So this is something we have to be on the watch for because the real aim is to try to discourage eligible voters from voting. And a lot of money and resources is going to go into this.
The Democrats should make ads about this, demonstrating what the Republicans are trying to do, because Trump has been gaining support among Hispanic men. So maybe this would be a nice little rebuttal. All right, Bill Galston.
Very quickly, I have a highlight, and that is the best book on rural America and the rural American vote and consciousness that has been written for a very long time. It's called The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. It's by two professors at Colby College, which I believe is in Maine, Nicholas Jacobs and Daniel Shea. And it is empirically solidly grounded. It is balanced and insightful and would teach the entire political system some very important lessons if people still bothered to read books.
Is it just out, freshly published?
Not exactly freshly published this year.
Oh, this year.
And,
okay.
And it hasn't gotten the attention it deserves because other shriller and much worse books have soaked up the attention. But we could do a real public service on this show.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a highlight. It comes from my colleague Andrew Egger, who noted. So you may all have heard this story that came out this week of a guy who was at first it looked he was at a Trump rally and it looked like he was trying to climb into the press pen to harass or hurt members of the media. And so that was the way the story was first told. And by the way, it led to Trump saying when the police were trying to subdue him, or the security guards, Trump said, "Oh, no, let him be. He's on our side." Right. Okay. So that's typical Trump sociopathic, it's okay to commit violence against people I don't like stuff. But it turns out that this guy was not attempting to harm the press. He was actually a protester, an anti-Trump protester that Andrew Egger got on the phone, a Bulwark reader. He just wanted to hold up a sign protesting that where Trump could see it. That's why he was trying to climb the riser there with the press were in. And anyway, eventually when it was all over, and he did get tased, and it was not a fun episode, but he told Egger later, his name is Stephen Weiss, and he said, "That is the most horrifying thing I've ever heard." Oh, he's talking about Trump saying, let him, he's on our side, just leave him alone. He said, "That's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard said about something I've been part of. To think that he's just so openly comfortable with criminality and with violence by Americans against other Americans, as long as he thinks it'll help him. I mean, he's just so transparently open about that. To think that he's got a coin flip chance of being in the White House and having basically no guardrails whatsoever, like absolute immunity, I think that's really unnerving," unquote. Thank you, Stephen Weiss. I'm sorry you had a very bad experience, but you're a good American. So I wanted to say thank you. And with that, I want to thank our panel, Kim Wehle, our guest, for joining us this week, and my regular panel, Linda Chavez, Damon Linker, Bill Galston. I also want to thank our producer, Jim Swift, and of course, all of our viewers and listeners. Beg to Differ will return next week, as every week.